10 True New Year Horror Stories. Story number 1, The Countdown. It was the last New Year's Eve before the new millennium, a night that should have been full of excitement and anticipation. The world was waiting for the turn of the century, for everything to change. But a group of friends had no interest in the parties or celebrations that the rest of the world was enjoying. They had decided to spend the night in an old mansion at the edge of town, far away from the noise of the city. The mansion had always been a place of strange stories and rumors. It was said to be haunted, though no one had ever seen anything for themselves. The house had stood empty for years, its owners long gone, leaving behind nothing but faded memories and dark corners. People said the air inside was thick with a presence, a heaviness that clung to you the moment you stepped through the door. But none of that mattered to the group of friends. They were curious, maybe even a little reckless. They had all heard the stories but didn't believe them. They arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sky began to turn gray. The mansion was even more imposing than they had imagined. Its tall windows were black, the shutters hanging loosely, as though they hadn't been touched in decades. The door creaked loudly when they pushed it open, as if it had been waiting for them. Inside, the house was cold, even though the heat was running. There was a strange smell in the air, like dust and old wood, but it was more than that. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing in the cold night. The group settled into the sitting room, laughing and joking as they opened bottles of wine and beer. They set up a small TV to watch the countdown to midnight, but the atmosphere in the room was starting to feel wrong. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, to grow darker, as though they were moving. As the evening passed, the friends grew quieter. The laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. The clock on the wall, an old brass timepiece that no one had really noticed before, began to tick louder. The seconds seemed to stretch, each one hanging in the air like a weight. Then, just before midnight, something strange happened. The clock, which had been counting down to the new year, began to tick backward. At first, no one said anything. They thought it was just the result of old machinery, some mechanical glitch. But as the minute hand slid backward, the air in the room seemed to change. It became colder, unbearably cold, and the shadows grew longer. One of the friends, Sarah, looked around the room, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. She had been staring at the clock, watching the seconds tick backward, and then she thought she saw something in the hallway just outside the door. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The others turned, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway, dark and silent. They laughed it off, trying to push away the unease creeping into their bones. But the air was thick, like a storm was about to break. The clock continued to tick backward, the sound now loud, almost deafening. Each passing second seemed to pull them deeper into something that wasn't quite right, something they couldn't escape. As the final moments of the year drew near, the temperature in the room dropped even further. The heat had completely failed. The group huddled together, but none of them could shake the feeling that something was coming, something they weren't ready for. And then, at midnight, the clock struck. It didn't just mark the turn of the year. The house seemed to exhale, a deep, unnatural sound that seemed to shake the very walls. And in that moment, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. The friends stood frozen, staring at the door, their breath visible in the frigid air. No one moved. And then, one by one, they began to disappear. First, Tom. He was standing by the window, staring out at the darkness. When the others turned to look at him, he was gone. No sound, no warning, just gone. Then Lisa, sitting on the couch, her eyes wide with terror. A faint whisper of wind was the only thing that stirred the air as she vanished. One by one, they all disappeared into the cold, into the shadows. Each time, the room grew darker, colder, and more silent. By the time the clock stopped ticking, no one was left. The mansion stood empty again, its dark secrets sealed away for another year. The clock on the wall had returned to its normal forward motion, but it would never strike 12 again. Not for them. They would never see another new year. The house would wait, empty and silent, for the next group of curious souls, brave or foolish, enough to test its dark, unexplainable power. Story number 2. The Echoing Voices. It was New Year's Eve, and Robert sat alone in his childhood home. The place was empty now. His parents had passed away years ago, and his sister had moved away too. He hadn't been back here in a long time. The house felt cold and lifeless without the sound of his family filling the rooms, without the warmth of shared laughter and the comfort of tradition. He'd always loved the holidays when he was a child, the way his parents would decorate the house and the way his sister's voice would ring through the hallways. But tonight, there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant rumble of the wind outside. The house hadn't changed much. It still smelled the same, like old wood and the faint trace of cinnamon from years past. Robert sat in the living room, staring at the clock on the mantelpiece. The hands were inching closer to midnight. His mind was elsewhere, back to when the house was full of life, when he'd run around with his sister, playing games and making mischief while their parents prepared dinner. He hadn't realized how much he missed it until now. The nostalgia was heavy, pressing against his chest. As the clock struck 12, a strange sound broke the silence. Laughter. At first, Robert thought it was just the wind or maybe a car driving by, but then it came again. The sound of his mother's laugh. It was soft, warm, like the way she used to laugh at his father's bad jokes. Then his father's voice followed, deep and full of life, followed by his sister's high-pitched giggle. It was unmistakable. His heart raced. He stood up from the couch, his legs heavy with confusion, and walked toward the sound. But the voices weren't coming from the living room. They weren't even coming from the kitchen where they used to gather on New Year's Eve to make a big meal. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Robert turned in circles, his breath shallow, his eyes wide with disbelief. He listened again. "Robert, come here," his mother's voice called softly from the kitchen. But when he stepped into the hall, the house was empty. The kitchen light flickered, but there was no one there. No signs of life at all. Just shadows, long and dark, stretching across the floor like they were waiting for something. The voices didn't stop, they only grew louder. "Come on, sweetheart, don't be shy," his father's voice said now, from somewhere deeper in the house. Robert's pulse quickened. He stepped into the hallway, toward the dark staircase that led up to his old room. The air was colder now, and the house felt alive with a strange energy he couldn't explain. He reached for the railing, but his hand trembled as he touched it, as if something was urging him not to go up. The laughter didn't stop. It was getting louder, as if his parents and sister were right there in the room with him, but they were still nowhere to be found. Every step he took toward the staircase made the sound of their voices echo more sharply in his mind. "Robert, where have you gone?" his sister's voice whispered, now sounding distant and sorrowful. "Come back." Robert's heart skipped a beat. The house had always been dark at night, but now it was different. The darkness seemed to press in around him, thicker than ever before. The voices, once familiar and comforting, now carried a sense of urgency, like something was terribly wrong. The warmth of the memories began to twist into something cold, something unsettling. The voices weren't just calling out to him, They were pleading with him, trying to draw him in. He took a step back, his mind racing. His parents' laughter faded, replaced by a low, creeping murmur that sounded more like a warning than anything else. The temperature in the hallway dropped, and Robert could see his breath in front of him, swirling in the dim light. He turned and ran toward the front door, but when he reached for the handle, it wouldn't open. He pulled harder, the cold metal biting into his palm. The laughter, now warped and twisted, rose in volume, filling his head. The voices came from inside his mind, deep, like an echo from a forgotten place. "Come back, Robert," his mother's voice repeated, but it wasn't right anymore. It was distorted, unnatural. "No," Robert muttered, backing away. "This isn't real." But the voices wouldn't stop. They were growing louder, and with each passing second, the warmth of his memories began to fade into something darker. He remembered his childhood clearly now, but those memories twisted. His mother's laugh, once so comforting, now had a sharp edge to it. His father's booming voice now seemed angry. His sister's giggle sounded hollow, like something was missing. Suddenly, the house around him felt much larger. The walls seemed to stretch, the shadows deepening. Robert was no longer sure where the voices were coming from. It felt like they were inside him, crawling through his mind, pulling him into the dark places he had long forgotten. The house was no longer a place of memory. It was a trap. His family was gone, but the house had kept their voices, their memories, twisting them into something unrecognizable, something hungry. And Robert was trapped, alone with them. The clock on the wall ticked, its hands frozen at midnight, marking the moment when the past and the present collided. The voices continued to call to him, louder than ever, until there was nothing left but the sound of his own racing heart and the echoes of a family he could never return to. And as the night stretched on, Robert knew the house would never let him leave. The voices had claimed him now, and there was no escape from their reach. Story number 3, The Last Toast. It was New Year's Eve, and a small group of friends gathered in a cozy, old apartment overlooking the city. The night was full of excitement, filled with laughter, chatter, and the clinking of glasses. Outside, the city was alive with lights, the cold air swirling around the streets, but inside, it felt warm and inviting. The group had been friends for years, and this was their tradition. A quiet celebration, just the 5 of them, no fuss, no crowd. Only the familiar faces they trusted. The room was decorated with tinsel and candles, and the table was covered with snacks and drinks. Each of them had a glass of champagne in hand, the bubbles sparkling in the low light. They were ready to ring in the new year, a fresh start, a time for new possibilities. They'd all been through a lot, and this night felt like the right moment to let go of the past and move forward. As the clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight, the group fell silent. They raised their glasses, waiting for the final countdown. The seconds seemed to stretch, each one hanging in the air like an eternity. One of them, Daniel, grinned and lifted his glass higher. "To the future," he said, his voice full of confidence, but there was something strange in his eyes. Something they all noticed, though no one said anything. The last few seconds passed in a blur. 10, 9, 8. They counted in unison. Then, as the clock struck 12, a sudden cold swept through the room. It was sharp, unnatural, like a gust of wind from somewhere deep inside the walls, though the windows were all closed. The temperature dropped, and the air grew heavy as if something had shifted. A soft hum filled the room, distant and low, like a vibration just beneath the surface. The friends looked at each other confused, but the moment quickly passed, and they laughed it off, attributing it to the excitement of the new year. But when they turned to look at their reflections in the mirrors hanging on the walls, they froze. Their faces were wrong. Distorted, twisted, almost like their reflections were mocking them. Their features were stretched, their eyes wider or narrower than they should have been, their smiles grotesque, unnatural. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was as if the mirrors were showing them a version of themselves that didn't belong, a version of themselves they didn't recognize. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel laughed nervously. "What the hell is going on?" His voice sounded strange, not quite his own, as though someone else were speaking through him. But the others weren't laughing. They were staring at the mirrors, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. One by one, they turned to look at each other, their faces twisted with confusion and fear. "What's happening?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. She reached up to touch her face, but when she did, her fingers felt wrong, like they weren't her own. She pulled back, staring at her hands in horror. A strange sound began to fill the room, like an echo. Only it wasn't coming from the friends themselves. It was coming from the walls, from the very space around them. Their own voices seemed foreign, distorted, like they were hearing them through a thick, muffled layer of glass. "We're not," Michael started, but his words were cut off by a loud crack, like the air itself had shattered. The room seemed to twist around them. The familiar apartment, with its old furniture and quiet charm, was no longer the place they knew. The walls bent and rippled, and the floor felt unstable beneath their feet. The light flickered, and the friends watched in horror as their reflections in the mirrors began to move on their own, separate from their bodies. They smiled, but not in the same way. The twisted versions of themselves grinned with a malice they couldn't understand. "I don't," Daniel gasped, but his voice was swallowed by the hum. The sound grew louder, the vibration shaking through their bones, as if the very air around them was alive, pressing in, closing off any escape. The room, once familiar, now felt like a different place. A parallel world where everything was wrong, where they were wrong. Their reflections, their voices, their very selves, everything was being warped into something nightmarish. They had stepped into the new year, but they had also stepped into a new existence. A world where time and reality itself seemed to fracture and twist. The cold deepened, and they looked out the window, hoping to see the familiar city skyline. But instead they saw nothing, only darkness. No lights, no stars, just an endless void. And in that moment they realized they were trapped, caught in a place that wasn't theirs, a place where nothing made sense. A new year, a new beginning. But for them, it wasn't a time for hope. It was the beginning of something far worse. They had not just crossed into the future, they had crossed into a nightmare. A place where the past and present no longer existed, and where their reflections would never be the same again. And as they stood in the center of the room, with the echoes of their distorted voices reverberating around them, they knew there was no going back. The future had claimed them, but it was a future that was not their own. Story number 4. The Harbinger. It was a cold New Year's Eve, the kind where the wind howls outside, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of winter through the cracks in the old wooden door. Evelyn sat in her small apartment, watching the clock on the wall, its ticking louder than usual. She had planned to spend the night alone, a quiet evening with a glass of wine, maybe some music, just to ring in the new year without the hassle of parties or the need to pretend she wasn't getting older. It had been a rough year. She didn't want to face anyone. At around 8 in the evening, there was a knock on the door. Evelyn wasn't expecting anyone, and she hesitated before answering. When she opened it, an old man stood on the other side. His face was wrinkled and pale, his eyes a sharp, unsettling blue that seemed to pierce through her. He was dressed in a tattered coat, his hands shaking slightly as he held out a crumpled envelope. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to disturb you," he said in a raspy voice, "but I need to give you this." Evelyn frowned, but took the envelope, her fingers brushing against his cold, clammy skin. She tried to close the door, but the man stepped in before she could stop him, as though he knew she would. His presence felt heavy, as if he carried a burden too dark for words. "Wait," he said, his voice low. "I have something to tell you." She froze. There was something about the way he spoke, the weight in his words. She stepped back as he slowly made his way into her apartment, his gaze flickering to the various things around her. Old photographs, keepsakes, things she had long since forgotten about. "You're Evelyn Parker, aren't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," she answered, uneasy. "Who are you?" The old man smiled grimly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is what I have to say." He looked her directly in the eye. "The year that begins tonight will be your last." Evelyn laughed nervously, thinking this was some kind of strange joke, or maybe a man lost in his own madness. "I don't know what you're talking about." But the old man didn't laugh. Instead, he said in a tone that sent a chill running down her spine, "The next year will take you. Every hour, every minute, you'll feel it closing in on you. You cannot escape it." Before she could respond, the man turned and left, walking slowly out the door without another word. Evelyn stood there, staring after him, the hairs on her neck prickling. She shook her head and closed the door, locking it. She told herself it was just some odd, rambling stranger, nothing more. Still, as the night wore on and the clock neared midnight, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She tried to ignore it, trying to enjoy her evening. She poured herself another glass of wine, turned on some music, and sat on the couch, but the weight in the room never left. At first, it was small things. The light in the kitchen flickered, a brief flash of darkness, but when she turned to look, it was fine again. A whisper of wind ruffled the curtains, though the windows were closed. But then it began to escalate. She stood to adjust the thermostat, but as she did, something caught her eye in the hallway. A shadow, just out of sight, darted across the wall. Her heart raced as she stepped forward to investigate, but there was nothing there. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but the feeling in the air was suffocating. The clock on the wall ticked louder now, each second echoing in her head. The room grew colder, and her breath began to fog the air in front of her. She turned toward the window. Outside, the city was quiet, but the night felt too still. The silence was unnerving, like the calm before a storm. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Evelyn felt something pull at her, a tug deep inside her chest, like she was being dragged towards something she couldn't understand. The old man's words echoed in her mind. "The year that begins tonight will be your last." She laughed nervously, trying to push the thought away. But then, in the reflection of the window, she saw it. A dark shape moving behind her, just at the edge of her vision. She spun around, her heart pounding, but again, nothing was there. She took a step back, her breath coming faster, and suddenly she heard it. A whisper, soft but clear, like a voice right next to her ear. "Evelyn." She whipped around, but the room was empty. No one was there. But the whisper had come from inside her mind, so real she could almost feel the breath against her skin. The air was heavy now, thick with an oppressive weight. Her pulse raced as the clock struck 12. She looked up, and for a brief moment everything seemed to freeze. The sound of the ticking stopped. The air became still. Then, in the reflection of the kitchen window, she saw something, someone, standing behind her. It was the old man. His face was twisted, dark, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. He smiled, but it was a cruel, hollow smile. His lips moved, but his voice came from everywhere, from all around her. "You cannot escape what is coming," he whispered. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she realized that he wasn't just a strange old man. He was something more. A harbinger, a warning. But it was too late. The year had already begun, and with it, whatever darkness he had foretold. She tried to run, but the room seemed to close in on her, the walls shifting, the shadows reaching for her. Every door, every window was locked, and the air grew colder, suffocating. The clock began ticking again, each second a countdown to something she couldn't outrun. And as the last stroke of midnight echoed in her ears, Evelyn knew that the old man's words had been true. The year that had begun was her last, and there was nothing she could do to stop what was coming. Story number 5. The Strangers. The Roberts family had been looking forward to a quiet New Year's Eve. It wasn't a big celebration, just close friends and family gathering at their house, sharing a meal and counting down the hours to the new year. The house, a cozy 2-story home on the outskirts of town, was warm with laughter and the smell of food. Their 2 kids, Luke and Emma, were playing with sparklers outside, while Mark and Sarah, their parents, chatted with friends inside. As midnight approached, the house buzzed with energy. Everyone was laughing and talking, the TV flickering in the background with the countdown to the new year. Sarah was finishing up some last-minute preparations in the kitchen, while Mark poured the champagne. They'd been through some tough times lately, illness, job struggles, but tonight they were ready to put it all behind them, at least for a few hours. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a new beginning. Then, just as the last few seconds before midnight ticked away, there came a soft knock at the door. Mark frowned, setting his glass down. "Who could that be?" he muttered, glancing around the room at the guests. No one had expected anyone else. The knock came again, more urgent this time, followed by a strange silence. "Maybe it's some kids playing a prank," Sarah said, though her voice had a tremor in it. Mark shrugged and walked to the door, pulling it open without thinking. But when he looked outside, the porch was empty. No one stood there. There was no sign of anyone, just the crisp, cold night air and the faint sound of distant laughter from other houses. He stepped outside briefly, peering into the darkness. "Hello?" he called, but there was no answer. Just the wind. He was about to close the door when he noticed something on the doorstep. An envelope, yellowed and aged, as though it had been lying there for much longer than it should have been. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, a sharp, jagged script that didn't look like anything he'd ever seen. "Mark, what is it?" Sarah called from inside, her voice anxious now. Mark picked up the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside was a single piece of paper, the edges frayed and torn. He unfolded it and read the message aloud, his voice growing colder with each word. "When the clock strikes 12, the strangers will come. They have been waiting for you. There is no escape." For a moment, no one said anything. The room seemed to hold its breath, as though it too was waiting for something. Sarah looked at Mark, her face pale, her eyes wide with unease. "That's just a joke, right?" she asked, her voice a little too high-pitched. Mark swallowed hard, trying to brush it off. "Probably just some pranks, Sarah, some kids messing with us." He crumpled the note and tossed it on the table. "Forget about it." But as the seconds ticked down to midnight, the strange feeling in the air only deepened. The room seemed heavier, darker. The laughter and chatter that had filled the house earlier now sounded hollow, distant. Everyone turned toward the TV, waiting for the countdown. 10, 9, 8. The tension was palpable. At the stroke of midnight, the door to the living room slammed shut. "Did you hear that?" Luke, the youngest, asked, his voice shaky. Before anyone could respond, a strange sound filled the house. A low, unsettling hum, as though something in the air had shifted. The room went silent, and then they appeared. At first, they were just silhouettes in the hallway, figures standing motionless in the shadows. But as the lights flickered, they came closer, emerging from the corners of the house like they had always been there, waiting. At first glance, they looked like ordinary people. Men and women, some dressed in old-fashioned clothes, others in casual modern wear. But there was something wrong about them. Their eyes were too dark, their faces too still, like masks that had been left on too long. They moved without speaking, as if they knew exactly where to go. Sarah took a step back, her heart racing. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. But the strangers said nothing. They just continued to move into the room, their gaze fixed on the family. The air grew heavier with each step they took, and the strange, oppressive feeling in the house grew worse. Mark tried to step forward, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as though an invisible force was holding him back, locking him in place. He turned to Sarah, his voice desperate. "We need to leave, now." But as he spoke, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. They were trapped. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah cried, backing up against the wall. The strangers didn't answer. They didn't need to. The family looked at each other, their faces pale with fear, as the strangers closed in around them. They were familiar, but not familiar at all, like something from a dream that you can never quite remember. Their eyes seemed to follow every movement the family made, and their silence spoke louder than any words could. As the strangers came closer, it became clear they weren't just visitors. They weren't just intruders. They had been waiting for this exact moment, for the stroke of midnight, for the year to change. And now that the new year had begun, there was no turning back. There was no escape. The house, once filled with the sounds of celebration, was now filled with an awful silence. And the family, unable to move, could only watch as the strangers closed in on them, their shadows stretching longer with every passing second. It was too late. The strangers had arrived, and the clock had started counting down again. Story number 6, The Last Call. Jason had never been one for New Year's celebrations. It wasn't that he disliked the idea of a fresh start. It was just that he didn't feel it. Not anymore. Not after everything that had happened. So, he found himself alone in the remote cabin in the woods, tucked away from the world. The isolation was comforting, a place where he could forget the mess of his life, his failed marriage, and the growing distance between him and his daughter. The cabin was small, rustic, and sparse, just the way he liked it. No distractions, no noise. It was just him and the silence of the woods. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, its warmth fighting off the cold that crept in through the cracks in the old wooden walls. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, counting down the final minutes of the year as the last traces of daylight disappeared behind the trees. Jason didn't drink. He didn't have any special plans. He had no one to call, no one to speak to. His ex-wife, Carla, had sent him a text earlier in the day, a short, polite message asking if he was okay. He hadn't responded. He didn't feel like it. He didn't know what to say anymore. He sat in the chair by the fire, staring at the flames. His thoughts drifted, moving between regret and guilt, his mind replaying the conversations that had led to the end of his marriage. How had it all gone so wrong? And why hadn't he tried harder to fix it? Then, just as the clock ticked toward midnight, the phone rang. Jason's heart skipped. He wasn't expecting any calls, not out here. He glanced at the old rotary phone on the small table beside him. It had been there when he rented the cabin, a relic of a time long past. The phone's shrill ring echoed in the silence, almost too loud. He hadn't even realized it was plugged in. He picked it up on instinct. "Hello?" Jason's voice was rough, more from surprise than anything else. There was a long pause on the other end, and then a voice he recognized, Carla's voice, quiet but urgent, filled with something he couldn't place. "Jason," she said, her tone wavering. "It's me. I need to talk to you. I have something important to tell you before the year ends." Jason's mind raced. Carla? What could she possibly want? He hadn't heard from her in months, not since the divorce papers were finalized. "Carla, where are you?" he asked, his voice thick with confusion and concern. "What's going on?" I can't explain over the phone," she replied, her voice trembling. "But you need to come. Please, Jason, it's urgent, I'll be waiting." Jason's heart pounded in his chest. He could hear the desperation in her voice, something that was completely out of place. She never sounded like that. It was as if something bigger than both of them, was pushing her to speak. Without thinking, Jason grabbed his jacket, his keys, and rushed out of the cabin. The road to the nearest town was treacherous, winding through thick forests and steep hills. The weather had turned colder, the snow falling heavier now, making the drive dangerous. But he didn't care. He had to get to her, to find out what was going on. The wind howled through the trees as he drove, the headlights slicing through the thick dark. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as the snowstorm picked up. His mind was racing, thinking of all the possibilities. What could Carla have to say? Why had she waited until now, until the last moments of the year? It was as if the world had conspired to bring them together again, to force him back into her life, if only for a brief moment. When Jason finally arrived at the cabin, the storm had grown stronger, and the world outside had become a blur of white. He pulled up to the small, dark structure, but something was wrong. The door was slightly ajar, the light inside flickering like a dying ember. He stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the cold air, and approached the cabin. He called out, his voice echoing in the empty night. "Carla?" His footsteps crunched in the snow as he reached the door and pushed it open. The cabin was silent, too silent. He stepped inside, his heart racing, but there was no sign of her. No coat, no purse, nothing. Just the faint smell of something decaying, a sour, old scent that didn't belong. His eyes scanned the room. Empty, abandoned, save for one thing. On the small table beside the bed was the old rotary phone, still plugged in. It was off the hook, the receiver lying in the cradle, abandoned. Jason stepped toward it, his hands shaking as he picked it up. The moment his fingers touched the receiver, a voice filled the air. "Jason," the voice repeated. It was Carla's voice, but it wasn't. It was distorted, hollow, as if coming from somewhere deep and far away, as if the voice was no longer truly hers. "Carla," Jason's voice broke. His throat was tight. The voice on the other end repeated his name, but it no longer sounded like her. The words began to lose their clarity, becoming garbled, like static on a broken radio. "Jason, Jason, Jason." Each repetition sounded less human, more distorted, more like something that shouldn't be speaking at all. His heart hammered in his chest as the voice twisted into a horrible, unnatural tone. The temperature in the room dropped, and the walls seemed to close in. Jason's breath came faster, more erratic. He stumbled back from the phone, dropping it onto the table, and his eyes darted around the cabin, searching for answers that weren't there. But the phone continued to ring, its shrill sound now the only thing left in the world. Jason stood frozen, the air thick with dread. The voice kept repeating his name, growing louder and more distorted with every passing second. And then, with the final stroke of midnight, everything fell silent. Jason was alone. The phone was dead. Carla was gone. He hadn't just driven into a storm. He had driven into something far darker, a place where the past and future collided, where nothing could ever be the same again. The last call had come, and with it, whatever haunted it had claimed him too. Story number 7. The Watcher. As the final hours of the year ticked away, Megan sat alone in her small apartment, her gaze fixed on the clock ticking steadily on the wall. It was just like any other New Year's Eve, except this time, there was no party, no friends, no one to celebrate with. She had moved to this quiet neighborhood only a few months ago, hoping for a fresh start. After a long, exhausting year of change and loss, the idea of being alone didn't bother her. In fact, it was a relief. But as midnight approached, something in the air shifted. It started subtly at first, a small feeling of unease that she tried to shake off. Megan noticed the shadows growing longer in the corners of her living room. The sunlight that usually poured through the windows during the day was gone now, replaced by a creeping darkness outside. She pulled the curtains tighter, trying to block out the growing chill in the air, but something didn't feel right. Her mind kept wandering to the windows, to the shadows she swore she saw moving just beyond the glass. She would glance over at them, but each time, there was nothing there. Nothing but the empty street, the faint reflection of her apartment's lights in the glass. Still, the feeling didn't fade. The eyes of the shadows seemed to follow her, no matter where she went. Megan stood up, shaking off the creeping sense of paranoia, and went to the window to look again. This time, she pulled the curtain aside with a quick motion, expecting to see nothing, as she always had. But something stopped her. There, in the corner of her vision, she saw the figure, a dark, shifting shape just beyond the edge of the glass. It was too far to make out clearly, but it was there, watching. Her heart skipped a beat. She stepped back, her breath quickening. The figure disappeared the moment she looked directly at it, vanishing into the shadows. She laughed nervously to herself, her pulse still racing. It was nothing, she told herself, just the night playing tricks on her. But as the minutes ticked closer to midnight, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. At 11:59, Megan's phone buzzed with a reminder. New Year's Eve countdown. She looked at the screen, then over at the clock on the wall. The second hand was winding down, the anticipation in the air palpable. She glanced once more at the windows just in case, but saw nothing. The moment the clock struck midnight, a loud, sudden noise echoed through her apartment. A sharp, echoing sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the hallway just outside her bedroom. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, dragging slightly as though someone was moving across the floor with purpose. Her breath caught in her throat. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. She moved toward the hallway, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination, or perhaps a trick of the wind. But when she looked into the dark hallway, it was empty. No one was there. The footsteps had stopped. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She backed away, retreating into her bedroom, her feet moving on their own. She locked the door behind her, almost expecting to hear the doorknob rattle or the sound of someone outside. But nothing came. The apartment was silent, save for her quick, shallow breaths. But then she heard it again. The footsteps, softer now, but still present. They were coming from the hallway, growing louder, closer. Megan's mind raced. It wasn't her imagination. She wasn't alone. The sound of the steps grew closer, now outside her bedroom door, as if whoever it was waiting just beyond the wood. She pressed her back to the bed, too terrified to move. She didn't dare open the door. Then, as the minutes passed, the shadows in the corners of her room seemed to shift. She could feel them, as if they were gathering, moving closer. The shapes in the darkness seemed to grow, filling the edges of the room, surrounding her. The room had never felt smaller, never felt more suffocating. The figures weren't just watching anymore, they were waiting. Watching for her. Waiting for her to do something, to make a choice, to move. The air was thick with a presence that she couldn't see but could feel. Something ancient and patient, waiting for her to take the next step. The figures in the shadows were waiting for something they'd been expecting for a very long time. And Megan, trapped in her bedroom, realized with growing dread that they were not just watching her. They were waiting for her to open the door. The footsteps outside stopped, but she could still hear them, closer now, right at the edge of the bed. And she knew that this time, there was no escaping them. Story number 8, The Snowfall. It was the kind of storm that made the world feel smaller, quieter, like the whole world was being swallowed by the snow. Emily and Jack had been driving through the countryside, hoping to make it home for New Year's Eve, but the snowstorm had caught them off guard. The road, once visible and easy to follow, had disappeared under a blanket of white. The wind whipped the snow in every direction, and the visibility was nearly zero. They'd tried to push forward, but it was no use. The storm was too strong, and the road had become too treacherous. The car had finally sputtered to a halt, buried in a snowdrift a few miles from the nearest town. "Looks like we're stuck," Jack said, his voice tight with frustration. Emily looked out the window at the swirling snow, her breath fogging up the glass. She had been quiet for a while, watching the storm grow more violent. "We need to find shelter," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Jack nodded, checking the car's GPS for nearby buildings, but nothing was within a reasonable distance. The storm wasn't letting up, and they both knew they needed to find somewhere safe for the night. After a few minutes, Jack spotted a dark shape through the snowflakes, a silhouette that seemed to rise from the storm like a forgotten relic. "Look," he said, pointing ahead. There, in the distance, barely visible through the snow, was an old cabin. It was small, its outline barely visible against the white landscape, but it was shelter. They made their way through the knee-deep snow, their feet slipping on the icy ground, until they finally reached the door of the cabin. Jack tried the handle, and it creaked open with surprising ease. Inside, the air was cold but dry. The cabin was old, the furniture dusty and forgotten, but it was safe. They could wait out the storm here. After locking the door behind them, Emily and Jack took off their wet coats and huddled together by the small fireplace. The fire crackled to life as Jack lit a match and set some dry wood ablaze. The warmth from the fire began to chase away the chill in their bones, but the silence of the cabin felt unnatural, oppressive. The wind howled outside, its eerie sound making the windows rattle. Emily wrapped herself tighter in her blanket, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in her chest. It was too quiet, too still in here. Even with the storm howling outside, there was an unsettling silence inside the cabin, as though it were holding its breath. "Maybe it's just the storm," Jack said, sensing her discomfort. "The cabin's probably just been empty for a while, that's all." Emily nodded, though she wasn't convinced. She tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, the strange weight pressing down on her, but it was impossible to ignore. She felt like the walls themselves were waiting for something. Something she couldn't see but could almost feel. As the minutes dragged on, the sound of the storm outside grew louder. The wind screamed through the cracks in the walls, but the silence inside the cabin deepened. It was suffocating, a quiet that settled deep into her bones. Then, just as they were beginning to settle into the idea of waiting until morning, the door creaked open. Both of them froze. The wind outside had stopped for a moment, leaving only the unnatural silence. The door, which they were certain had been locked, stood ajar, the wood creaking as though something, or someone, had pushed it open. Jack stood up quickly, his heart racing. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaky. There was no response, just the hollow silence of the cabin. Emily felt her stomach twist into knots. "Close the door," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack moved toward the door, but before he could reach it, they both saw something that made their blood run cold. A figure stood in the doorway. It was pale, its skin almost white, as though it hadn't seen the sun in years. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and thin, but it was its eyes that struck them the most. They were black, empty voids, like two deep holes in the middle of its face, staring at them with an unsettling intensity. The air around them seemed to chill even further. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stared, its presence heavy in the doorway. Jack opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Emily felt her throat tighten, the air growing thin, as though the room was closing in on her. The figure tilted its head slightly, almost as if considering them, then opened its mouth. But the sound that came from its lips wasn't a language they understood. The words were guttural, strange, a language that seemed to echo from a time long forgotten, too ancient for them to grasp. The figure's intent was clear, though. It wasn't here by accident. It wasn't lost. It had come for them. The storm had trapped them, but it wasn't the snow that had brought them here. The snow had only been the messenger. Something ancient, something that had waited in this cabin for longer than they could comprehend, had now set its sights on them. The figure stepped forward, slowly, its black eyes never leaving them. Emily felt the floor beneath her tremble, as if the earth itself was waking up, preparing for what was to come. Jack reached out toward her, but his hand was shaking too much to hold her. It wasn't just the snowstorm that had trapped them here. It was something far older, far more dangerous. And they both knew as the figure moved closer that they wouldn't make it through the night. Story number 9. The Mirror. Jenna had always been a collector of oddities, drawn to the strange and mysterious. When she saw the antique mirror at the New Year's Eve auction, she felt an instant connection. It was beautiful, its frame carved with intricate patterns, tarnished gold giving it an old-world charm. The glass, though slightly fogged, still held a certain allure. She imagined it would fit perfectly in her living room, a piece of history that would add elegance and a touch of mystique to her space. The auction was packed with people eager to find treasures, but when the mirror came up, there was an unsettling stillness in the room. People whispered, exchanged glances, but no one seemed particularly eager to place a bid. Jenna, however, was captivated. The bidding was low, and before long the mirror was hers. The auctioneer's voice echoed in her mind long after she had won it. "A rare find indeed. Perhaps this will bring you good luck in the new year," he had said, his words almost casual, but something about them lingered in the air, like an unspoken warning. That evening, as the world prepared to welcome the new year, Jenna placed the mirror carefully on the wall of her living room. She adjusted the lighting, making sure it caught the glow of the candles she'd lit. The reflection seemed perfect, calm, serene. Nothing out of the ordinary. As midnight approached, Jenna sat back on the couch, sipping her glass of champagne. The television countdown played in the background, and outside, fireworks began to light up the sky. She looked into the mirror, half expecting to see the reflection of herself, but there was nothing unusual, nothing at all. But as the clock struck 12, something changed. At first, it was so small she almost missed it. A shadow, moving in the reflection but not in the room. She glanced at it, thinking it was just a trick of the light, but it seemed to be there, just at the edge of her vision. She stood up and moved closer to the mirror, her heart picking up pace for reasons she couldn't explain. Then, it happened again. A hand, pale and thin, reached out from the surface of the glass. It was just a flicker at first, something almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make her breath catch. She stared harder, convinced she had imagined it. But no, there it was again, the hand, its fingers stretching, clawing, as if it were trying to reach her. The air in the room grew colder, and Jenna stepped back, her eyes fixed on the mirror, unable to look away. And then the reflection began to shift. It wasn't her reflection anymore, not entirely. The woman staring back at her was familiar, but distorted. Her features were slightly askew, the skin too pale, the eyes too wide, like someone trying to mimic her but failing. Her own reflection twisted and stretched in unnatural ways, and she felt a sudden visceral urge to turn away, but she couldn't. The figure in the mirror began to move, its mouth opening in a silent scream. Jenna could hear her breath quicken, her pulse thudding in her ears, but the reflection remained silent, its movements exaggerated, grotesque. The woman in the mirror began to claw at the glass, her nails scratching the surface as if trying to break through. Jenna backed away, but the reflection remained in place, still trapped. Something darker, something far more sinister, was creeping into the glass. Jenna's hands shook as she reached for the phone. She needed to call someone, anyone, but the words wouldn't come. The reflection of herself in the mirror wasn't speaking, but Jenna could hear something. An echo, a whisper, coming from the surface of the glass. It was faint at first, like a distant murmur, but it grew louder, clearer, until it felt like it was coming from inside her own mind. "Help me," the reflection whispered, the voice cold and hollow, like the sound of a faraway cry, lost and begging for release. Jenna's heart raced. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stepped closer, mesmerized by the sight in front of her. The woman in the mirror, who wasn't her, kept reaching out, her hand now fully pressing against the glass, her fingers curling in desperate motions. Suddenly, the reflection's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, Jenna thought she saw something that wasn't human. Something old, something ancient, watching her, waiting for her to do something. The reflection twisted again, its face contorting into something monstrous, a grotesque version of herself, its smile wide and mocking. Jenna stumbled back, her knees buckling as she fell to the floor. Her eyes never left the mirror, where the figure, whatever it was, began to move again, slowly but deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world. And then, just when she thought she might lose control, the figure's hand pressed harder against the glass, pushing out of the surface, as if trying to break through. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows thickening as the clock ticked on. Jenna scrambled to her feet, looking for a way to break the connection. But no matter where she went, the reflection followed her. The dark presence in the glass always watching, always waiting. By the time the new year had truly begun, Jenna realized the mirror wasn't just showing her a reflection. It was showing her something far worse. Something had followed her home. Something that was reaching out through the glass from a place she couldn't understand. A place where it had been waiting, patiently, for a long, long time. And now it had come for her. Story number 10. The Countdown of the Dead. The town of Hollow Creek was a place where people didn't speak much about the past. It was the kind of town where everyone kept to themselves, and the old stories were whispered rather than told. One of those stories was the legend of New Year's Eve, the tale that every year, as midnight approached, the souls of the dead would return to Earth, looking to claim those who had been forgotten. The dead, it was said, came to collect the living for their sins. Most people dismissed it as just an old superstition, a story meant to frighten children. But on the last New Year's Eve, a group of strangers passing through the town would learn that some stories weren't meant to be forgotten. The group consisted of 4 people, all drawn to the town for different reasons. Sarah, a writer looking for inspiration; Mark, a trucker on his way home; Angela, a woman escaping an abusive relationship; and David, a man trying to escape a dark past. They had found their way to Hollow Creek by chance, drawn to the same rundown inn on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with the feeling of something ancient, something waiting, as the hours ticked toward midnight. As the night began to unfold, something strange began to happen. It started with Sarah. She was the first to notice the dreams. At first, they were faint, memories of a place she didn't recognize, faces she couldn't name. But as the night wore on, the dreams grew stronger, more vivid. She saw an old woman, her face twisted in pain, begging for something, though Sarah couldn't understand what she wanted. There was a man, too, with dark eyes and a bitter smile, staring at her as though he knew her, as though he had been waiting for her. Sarah woke with a start, her heart racing, the dreams still clinging to her mind. She got up and looked out the window. The town was quiet, almost too quiet. The clock in the hallway ticked loudly in the silence, marking the passage of time. Soon, Mark experienced the same unsettling dreams. In his, he was walking down a long, dark hallway, hearing the sound of footsteps behind him. But when he turned to look, no one was there, just a whispering voice calling his name. He awoke in a cold sweat, the echo of the voice still ringing in his ears. He tried to brush it off, but a sense of unease lingered. Angela's dreams were different, more direct. She saw her father, who had died years ago, standing at the foot of her bed, his face full of disappointment. "You haven't changed," he told her, his voice like gravel. "You've forgotten what matters." When she woke up, she was left with a sinking feeling in her chest, as if the dream was a warning, but she didn't understand what it meant. David, the last to fall victim to the strange dreams, was haunted by a vision of a graveyard, his own grave. He saw a figure standing over it, its face obscured by shadows, its hand reaching out to touch his name on the tombstone. David felt a shiver run down his spine, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. The feeling lingered long after he woke, making the room feel smaller, colder. As the night wore on, the group began to share their dreams, realizing they had all experienced similar visions of people they didn't know, places they had never been, and tragedies they had never heard of. The atmosphere in the inn grew thick with tension, as though the air itself was closing in around them. The clock on the wall ticked louder, its ticking echoing in the silence. The clock in the hallway struck 11:45 p.m., and the dreams became more frequent, more intense. The group, now wide awake and unsettled, tried to distract themselves, but the visions wouldn't stop. In every corner of the room, they saw glimpses of things that weren't there. Shadows moving, faces appearing in the reflection of the window. The air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, and the temperature in the room dropped, though no one could explain why. When the clock finally struck 12, everything changed. A loud crash echoed from outside the inn, followed by a strange, low moan, as though the earth itself was groaning in pain. The group rushed to the window, staring out into the night. What they saw was impossible. There, standing in the distance, was a cemetery that hadn't been there a moment before. They ran outside, their hearts pounding in their chests, the cold air biting at their skin. The cemetery stretched out before them, rows upon rows of gravestones, the names worn away by time. But what unsettled them most was the feeling, the overwhelming sensation that something was waiting for them, that they were not alone. As they moved through the cemetery, the dead seemed to come alive around them. Figures appeared out of the darkness, shapes of people, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and empty. The group tried to move faster, but their feet seemed to drag, as though they were sinking into the earth. The figures moved closer, their eyes fixed on the group, their movements slow but deliberate. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she saw the face of the old woman from her dream. Mark screamed as he saw the man with the dark eyes and bitter smile. Angela reached out, trying to grab David's hand, but he was already standing still, his gaze fixed on the graveyard. "Do you see?" David whispered, his voice barely audible. "They've come for us. They've come to collect." The figures grew closer, their cold hands reaching out for the living. And as the clock ticked past midnight, they realized the truth of the old legend. This wasn't just a story. The souls of the dead had returned, and they weren't leaving until they had claimed those who had been forgotten. And in that moment, they understood that the countdown wasn't just to the new year, it was the countdown to their end.